You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 9th of January 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist. I'm Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, is this the end of a military era?
And that's why today I'm proud to announce a new $2.4 billion package of security assistance.
The so-called Ramstein group of 50 nations meets to discuss support for Ukraine. We'll ask how things could change with Donald Trump in the White House. Also coming up, 13th time lucky. Lebanon's politicians will try once again to choose a president. We'll examine the chance of bringing calm to a country in dire need of it. Plus the papers, the fashion news and... why Paris wants its noisy police cars to calm down. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. President Biden has instructed the US military to provide extra help for firefighters in California. Israel's military says it's retrieved the body of a hostage seized by Hamas during the 7th of October attacks in 2023. And the funeral takes place later today at Washington National Cathedral of the former US President Jimmy Carter, who died last week, aged 100. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, the US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin will carry out one of his last jobs in post today, and arguably it's one of the most crucial. That of his final meeting with the Ukraine Defense Contract Group, or Ramstein Group. It was Austin himself who set the group up shortly after Russia's invasion, and this last meeting not only is his farewell, but also the tying up of the Biden administration's final efforts to support Kyiv before Donald Trump takes over in Washington. Well, I'm joined now by Orysia Lutsavich, who's head of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. A very good morning to you, Orysia. Welcome to Monocle Radio.
Good morning.
Let's just get the context of this immediately, straight away. This was Lloyd Austin's idea, wasn't it? It was his plan.
I think in the first place, it was Biden's idea, because as Russia invaded Ukraine almost 3 years ago, the biggest fear of Biden's administration was actually direct war with Russia in Europe. So what he did, he put NATO on the back footing. All senior NATO officials were actually banned even from going to Ukraine. And they have set up this group at one of the U.S. military bases in Germany to coordinate military assistance. So that was kind of a way to avoid Russia speculating and spinning disinformation that is actually fighting NATO and not Ukraine. And it's not an aggressor, but is actually doing a defensive war. Otherwise, NATO would have invaded it.
And this is an enormous group, isn't it? It consists of more than 50 countries, including all 32 NATO members.
It is an enormous group, and a silver lining to kind of what in Ukraine, to be honest, was perceived as absence of NATO, because that is the transatlantic union that it was supposed to, ensure peace in Europe and defend the alliance. Was the fact that so many non-European countries, from Japan to Australia, could join and actually be a channel for providing and coordinating military assistance to Ukraine.
So we have less than 2 weeks before Donald Trump takes over at the White House. What are they hoping to achieve in Ramstein today?
From my reading of the situation, is they are desperately front-loading Ukraine with as much military assistance as possible, because that assistance was legally earmarked for Ukraine, that Biden's administration was, to be honest, slow in airlifting to Ukraine and deploying it either on the battlefield or stockpiling. And now what they want to do is want to make sure Kyiv is in a stronger position on the battlefield, as Keith Kellogg, special Trump's representative, is trying to find some kind of a political diplomatic solution to the war. So the idea is make Ukraine strong so that it's not being pushed and pressured to make concessions that will undermine its sovereignty, independence, and possibly expand the war, embolden the aggressor for more militaristic action.
What is expected to change from the 20th of January? We already have warnings coming from the likes of the Polish defense minister, who said that this may be the last time that the group meets in its current format. What do we take him to mean by that?
It's interesting how elections everywhere, let's not forget there will be elections also in Poland, overshadow a lot of, reality on the ground. The fact is that there's been a decision now in NATO to take over coordination of military assistance to Ukraine. NATO, and I mean here mainly European allies of NATO, in case United States decides to take more isolationist step. So possibly because of that, it is the last meeting, but we don't know. I think, to be honest, everywhere from Tokyo to Washington, there is a feeling that Russia is a threat. There's an understanding that even if there is a ceasefire, Russian threat is not going away, not only from Europe, but from other theaters such as Africa and East Asia. And we see Russia also playing a role in the Middle East with the Houthis and bombing of the trade routes. So I think the group will remain in coordination. And we do see countries like Japan and Australia coming even to NATO meetings more frequently, NATO summits. But a lot may change for Ukraine depending on Trump's personal position and his skill in negotiating with Putin. And that's a big question, whether he will walk into Putin's trap or he will indeed talk from the position of strength and give himself some time. Actually, hopeful news is the statement of Keith Kellogg yesterday that they're not trying to solve this in 24 hours, but he gives them 100 days. That's already a better news than rushing into some kind of a deal that could jeopardize the future.
Indeed. I mean, Donald Trump has already said the policy that the United States changes, the United States holds with regards to Ukraine will change. And you've just mentioned the shifting to 100 days to stop the war. But while the United States seems to be, or while we are waiting to see what Trump will do, is there any shoring up going on now, either within NATO or within the Ramstein group, to try to make sure that the support for Ukraine, which is being so thoroughly front-loaded at the moment, will continue?
There's an interesting development going on actually at the European Union level, and that is the attempts to set up a 500 billion euro joint loan vehicle to invest in Europe's defense industry. That will be managed by the European Central Bank, and it will be voluntary contribution and participation from the EU member states. But I think that is Ursula von der Leyen's answer, kind of mimicked after COVID's relief package, where they had joint borrowing. And she will try to put it on the table in front of Donald Trump, saying, look, we are investing 500 billion. It's in our defense, but a lot of that will also go to support Ukraine. Another effort is, of course, the call to seizing Russian sovereign assets, not just using the profit from those assets to provide Ukraine, but to actually take the principle and buy weapons for Ukraine, kind of free up that financial instrument at times when countries struggle with deficits rising and their budget problems.
Finland's foreign minister said yesterday that NATO membership is the only guarantee of safety for Ukraine. How far along the line are we towards that now?
That's a critical question, and that it is a wider question of what kind of defense and security arrangements could be for Ukraine in order to deter any further or future war of Russia against Ukraine. I personally also think that all territory that are under Kyiv's control should be taken into the NATO alliance, because Ukraine is able to it has the most capable armed forces, and actually is the first line of deterrence against Russian attack in Europe. The rest of occupied territory, similarly to the West, the way it happened with East Germany, and when West Germany became member of NATO, could be later accepted into alliance. But what is key is that no territorial changes by force should be recognized neither by Trump nor any other leaders in the world. And the big answer for Ukraine's defense is that collective security, but also its own growing of its own reserve. Even if, again, there is ending of hot war, Ukraine will always be, until Putin is in power, on the hot spot, and it must train reserve. It must build its defense and military production. There's no shortcuts in that.
The sense is that any membership of NATO would be significantly further down the line. It cannot happen immediately, especially given the idea given the fact that the war is now approaching its third year mark. But when you hear the likes of Emmanuel Macron and noises coming from many parts of the West that this war needs to end this year and needs to be and that negotiated conclusions need to be drawn this year, what are your thoughts and hopes as a Ukrainian?
Well, wars don't end on schedule. We're in the worst possible situation when the war starts, and it's unpredictable. Any military experts or strategists will tell you that any plans and desires, when they hit reality, they shatter into pieces. My biggest worry is not what Macron or Trump said, but what actually Putin says, because he shows no sign of sensible desire to negotiate or to end this war. Unfortunately, his regime now, in his late years, has built its legacy on destroying Ukraine, on annexing or making part of its territory Russia, and the rest. I think his strategy is to create this union state, make kind of a Belarus out of Ukraine, and recreate a mini Soviet Union where he would be the leader of that supranational state. And Putin still keeps saying that Ukraine should move its troops from the regions of Ukraine like Zaporizhia or Kherson that he hasn't even occupied. So unfortunately, I think it's only when Russian generals will come to Putin and say, we are facing huge disaster on the battlefield, so let's cut losses short and try to settle it politically. Otherwise, I don't see any serious negotiations with that kind of man in the Kremlin.
Orysia Lutsevich, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. (9:13 a.m. in Beirut, 7:13 a.m. here in London. Now, Lebanon's parliament will try to elect a president today. It will be its 13th attempt to do so since October 2022, when Michel Aoun stepped down from office. In that time, the country has experienced political gridlock, a collapsed economy, war between the militant group Hezbollah and neighbouring Israel, and more recently, the end of the regime in neighbouring Syria. Well, I'm joined now by David Wood, a senior analyst for Lebanon at the International Crisis Group. I'm delighted to say he joins us on the line from Beirut. A very good morning to you, David.
Good morning. How's it going?
It's very well, thank you. And how is Beirut this morning? Is it poised to see a successful vote, any more successful than any of those that have gone before?
So I think so. Today, I'm very optimistic that we will finally have a president after 2 years and 2 months of a vacuum since the last president, Michel Aoun, stood down at the end of October 2022. In the city, there's a lot of calm at the minute. I think there'll be pretty heavy police presence around the parliament, but there's not an air of tension around. I think that it's become a fait accompli that today, unless there's a major surprise, the current commander of the Lebanese army, Joseph Aoun, will be elected as the next president. And while there might be a surprise here or two in terms of how the vote shakes out, it's very likely that he'll be elected before the end of the day.
Why is there a better sense of certainty this time around?
So I think that what's changed is that not for the first time in Lebanese history, it has been a combination of regional circumstances, international pressure that have made Lebanon's leaders overcome their individual and political differences to come together and elect a new president. So before the war started between Hezbollah and Israel, there had been months of wrangling over the presidency, which was based not just on the question of Hezbollah and its role inside Lebanon, but also personal political rivalries between different elites here in Lebanon. What's changed is that, especially with the massive escalation in the war and now the ceasefire that's still holding between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, there's real international pressure to end this nonsense, to elect a president, which will allow a new government to be formed finally, and to get on to the key priorities that Lebanon faces, the main ones of which are to implement the ceasefire, to attract aid and oversee post-war reconstruction, and to finally deal with the crippling economic crisis that's gripped the country since October 2019.
Joseph Aoun is the leader, the commander of the Lebanese military, the man who you say is the most likely to be elected, is backed by the United States. How much is that an important factor in all this?
It's a hugely important factor because, as we were just saying, the key priority right now, especially for the United States and its ally Israel, is for the ceasefire to be successfully implemented. For that reason, it's important not just to have a president and a new government, but also a president who has the trust and confidence of the international community. Now, Joseph Aoun is someone who does not have a political following, and it's unclear actually exactly what his politics are, but he does inspire trust and confidence from the international community as the leader of the military. He's been a very competent Lebanese army commander, and also he commands the respect of many people inside Lebanon, in the sense that he is the head of the most respected state institution, which is the army, and his reputation is not tainted by corruption, unlike many other senior Lebanese political figures or public figures.
So explain, therefore, what prospects there are for calm and for stability if Joseph Aoun is elected.
Well, I suppose that if we think about the ceasefire agreement again, it's probably, in the eyes of Israel and the United States, a good step that Joseph Aoun is not a Hezbollah ally. But I also would not say that he's a Hezbollah enemy. And that could actually be quite a good thing, because at the end of the day, even though Lebanon signed up to the ceasefire agreement with the approval behind the scenes of Hezbollah, the actual implementation of the agreement will require the cooperation of Hezbollah, simply because Hezbollah, despite its massive losses in recent months due to Israel's attacks, still retains a lot of military power. And indeed, I would expect enough military power to deter any party in Lebanon, including the Lebanese army, from violently confronting it. So the fact that Hezbollah and Joseph Aoun have had a working relationship on a professional level in the past, in his capacity as the Lebanese army commander, means that there is slight cause for optimism that perhaps if Hezbollah decides to cooperate, it could work alongside Joseph Aoun in terms of implementing the ceasefire agreement in a decent way.
I mean, what you speak of there places Hezbollah in a position of power and great influence. How much has that power and influence been affected, indeed decimated, by the Israeli operation against it, the conflict with it?
Well, I think it's worth considering that Hezbollah has clearly retained both political and military strength. So aside from what happened during the war with Israel, it still, along with its main Shiite political partner, the Amal movement, controls the political representation of the Shiite community here in Lebanon, which is very important because under Lebanon's power sharing conventions, all major decisions, including the one that will be taken today about electing a president, need to be approved by the major sects. So that is legitimate representation inside state institutions, which gives Hezbollah power. But yes, of course, it also has its military program, which, while it has been severely weakened, gives it still a military card that it can potentially play. Now, Hezbollah, up until now, has said that it's willing to comply with the ceasefire agreement in the areas close to the border with Israel, but that it refuses to disarm completely. So while Joseph Aoun is someone who is seen as a strong figure and as someone who has a good reputation and who has a working reputation with Hezbollah, he does face a bumpy road ahead if Hezbollah continues to insist that it won't allow for the ceasefire agreement to be implemented completely.
And in terms of the international positioning of this, I mean, we've talked extensively about the Israeli influence in all this, and the fact that the 60-day ceasefire needs to hold. But what about Lebanon's other neighbours? I'm thinking most importantly of Iran.
Sure. So Iran's position up until now is not completely clear in terms of what its next steps would be with Hezbollah. So it has invested huge amounts of money over decades in the group. And has seen a very decent proportion of those gains has been erased by Israel's attacks in the past weeks and months. However, it's also worth thinking about Iran's regional rival, I should say, which is Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia has not been particularly involved in Lebanese politics for most of the past decade. It had sort of retreated from the country and decided that it would focus its priorities elsewhere. Now, Saudi representatives have been coming to Lebanon in the past week and have made it very clear that they would like to see a president elected, and apparently have signaled that they would like that president to be Joseph Aoun. Now, why is that important? Because Hezbollah will need to find a way to fund reconstruction of all of the areas that have been destroyed during the war in Lebanon, many of which are in communities that are aligned with Hezbollah. Now, Iran obviously has its own economic problems. Hezbollah has difficulty reconstructing itself through Syria, given the fall of its former ally, Bashar al-Assad. So it is very likely that the party with the deep enough pockets to help out Lebanon and to help our constituents of Hezbollah would be Saudi Arabia. So for that reason, this is cause for optimism that perhaps Hezbollah will be more keen to take a step back from politics to allow parts of the ceasefire agreement to be implemented, and potentially economic reforms, which are clear conditions for Saudi Arabia to contribute significantly to Lebanon's recovery from the war.
David Wood, thank you for joining us on the line from Beirut. Still to come on today's programme.
We're going to get rid of fact checkers and replace them with community notes similar to X, starting in the US.
Meta's Mark Zuckerberg there. We'll find out later why big tech is moving closer towards Donald Trump ahead of his inauguration. Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Let's continue with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Rob Harris, Europe correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Good morning. Are we still all right to say Happy New Year, or has that ship sailed?
Oh, I think it's sailed.
Okay. I won't wish you a Happy New Year. How's life in the Harris world?
Very well, thank you. Although, certainly enjoying this wonderful London weather.
Yes, it's hats indoors weather.
It is
was the
indeed.
First thing I said this morning. Right, what have we got in the papers? Warm us up with some good stories.
Well, I just thought it was a fascinating story in the FT posted overnight about Romania. Now, Romania, the presidential election there last year was to me one of the most fascinating stories in Europe, and the rise of sort of Russian interference in elections, which we've seen for a long time. But I don't think we've seen, if people are right, anything so brazen, mainly through TikTok. And, of course, that was annulled. The Constitutional Court annulled the result, which even people who are, very worried about the rise don't feel comfortable with the fact that, a democratic election result was annulled. But there's an interesting poll out, and this poll says more than 40% of respondents are happy to vote for the pro-Putin far-right candidate, Kalin Georgescu, when the election happens again in May. Now, the poll was commissioned by actually a rival, who's the mayor of Bucharest, a Liberal pro-EU politician who plans to run in May. And the FT is reporting there are some doubts about the poll. However, it's just, I guess, another indication on how crazy this potentially election may be in May.
Indeed. We have to talk about the fact that this is, and several commentators are saying that this is the social media election and the ability for social media to influence outcomes. Because if you look at Calendar Georgescu was doing really badly in the polls before the election, and then suddenly whoosh, it sort of went right ahead. Yeah. And everyone suggested that TikTok was crucial to its success. So it's this terribly difficult situation, isn't it? That democratically it, to all intents and purposes, not a fairly run election, too much influence from Russia. However, he won.
Yeah, exactly. So, and look, of course, we've seen in Albania that TikTok's been banned for a year. We know Donald Trump has been talking about TikTok now, whether banning TikTok now, whether that actually happens or not. We've seen social media bans elsewhere. We've seen Elon Musk this week. It really is a fascinating time in the world of democracy and sort of the interconnection with social media.
And it looks at the fact that I think Meta was criticised as well for not enforcing its own policies when it comes to, I think there's some coordinated posts as well. I mean, we'll be looking a little bit later on in the programme about Mark Zuckerberg and its self-regulation. But this is a sort of a wider challenge to Europe, isn't it? And its ability or indeed its lack thereof to make sure that there is good self-regulation.
Of course. And the other issue is that so many young people are actually flocking to social media and not reading newspapers, not, watching old-fashioned news and radio like they used to. So this is really important to them. They care about it. There's going to be backlash if there are bans. So it's a very complex issue to deal with.
Let's move to an article in the Sydney Morning Herald that you wanted to draw our attention to. And it's an interesting one because it is a good thing to look to Australia to see how it deals with wildfires. When we see the crisis that's taking hold in Los Angeles and around the city, Australia has to deal with this on a very regular basis.
Yeah, of course. And, bushfires, growing up in Australia, bushfires are very much part of life over the summer, and you expect them to happen every couple of years. However, there's been some marked changes, and I think the black summer fires of 2019-2020 really changed the outlook of bushfires because places burnt that hadn't burnt before, places that were tropical, places, quite early, sort of late spring, that would never have burnt before, were burning all of a sudden, and everyone's going, what's happening here? Is this the impact of climate change? Similar thing happened, obviously, in California this week. This isn't the time of year. It is winter there. This isn't the time of year where such fires take hold. But there's a really interesting piece in the Sydney Morning Herald just talking through how it may have happened and the fact that these Santa Ana winds, desert winds, are very strong and gusty. Now, they're not unusual at this time of year, but they've usually far less intense, but it's really sort of been the perfect storm in the fact that most of this area has not recorded rainfall over 2.5 millimetres, which is the threshold that would reduce wildfire risk since last May. And really, these winds plus the dryness of the vegetation has really become quite a problem, and we're seeing it play out now.
Indeed. Let's move on to an article in Le Monde, which sort of makes one think of those queues of backpacking teenagers who are endlessly bored as they're waiting to go around a museum, which is full of very beautiful things, but possibly not necessarily relevant to 14-year-olds. The Musée d'Orsay in Paris has decided that something needs to be done to make beautiful art more interesting to young people.
Yeah. I was lucky enough to be in Paris for a month during the Olympics, went here probably 3 or 4 times just on my downtime because it's such a wonderful place to hang out. But really interesting interview in Le Monde with the new president of the museum, who's basically saying we need to offer 18 to 25-year-olds more stimulating programming. He's talking about much more interactive.
That means screens, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And virtual reality with headsets and all this stuff. He said they've had a couple of examples. There was Paris 1874, the Impressionist receptionist a couple of months ago, had a huge satisfaction rate, brought young people into the museum that haven't been there before. There's a quote in this article that says, "These experiences will one day become as normal as audio guides are today."
There's a lot of that going on at the minute, and it's a strange balance to strike, isn't it? Because you can see in an era when, especially Generation Alpha, the world is seen through screens. You're born with an iPad in your hand or whatever. Whether placing yourself in a massive room with a giant sunflower by Van Gogh is actually, I don't know, how helpful is it? How right is it? Because when you then go and look at the real thing, it seems a bit small.
I must admit it doesn't sit comfortably with me, but there are some interesting ideas he has here, and I thought interesting too in this article, he says we need to show the history of art, but also the social history and the history of ideas. And he's much more open to a lot of these interactive things. They're even talking about the Dreyfus affair, which is quite famous in France, a political event. He's also talking about having potentially a mock trial later on this year as part of what the museum has to offer. So we're really moving away from just a room full of paintings, I guess.
Yeah, a bit of dress up. Right. Finally, we are big on urbanism here in the studios at Monocle Radio. There's a fabulous article in the Washington Post, thank you for drawing our attention to this, that actually pollution is not a modern problem. This is something that they have discovered was a major issue during the Roman Empire, so much so that people actually, their mental capacity was affected.
Yeah, incredible, really. So this is silver and the mining of silver, which of course made the Roman Empire through, currency and military. But yeah, they've, by studying the ice cores in the Arctic, which are preserved from 27 BC, they've actually found that Roman smelters were releasing lead into the atmosphere at incredible rates, and the tiny particles, these tiny particles are still left, preserved in the earth. Now, preserved in the earth, I should say. The authors estimate that the exposure was enough to reduce the typical IQ 2.5 to 3 points across the empire, based on data from modern studies that show a link between child lead exposure and cognitive decline. So
you have cognitive decline because of the lead, the use of lead in silver smelting.
Yes.
But then you have, as you've just mentioned, that they've found particles in the Arctic.
Yes.
Tell us more about what the article is saying. I'll pull it up for us as well. This is an astonishing idea.
Yeah. That
there have been scientists in the Arctic who have found bits of Roman lead in the ice. It's quite astonishing.
Yeah. So this is they estimate the. I'm just going back to this article.
It says that the tiny particles of lead found in the ice had drifted from Europe on air currents.
Correct. And so they've been able to sort of mine and study these levels, which is quite remarkable. And in terms of leaving the footprint now, we talk about plastic bags not being able to degrade for centuries, but here we've got the example now, which is they're talking about this is the first sort of example of pollution and how it changed the earth.
Amazing stuff. Rob Harris, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. The time here in London is 7:32 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist. A look now at what else we're keeping an eye on today. President Biden has instructed the US military to provide extra help for firefighters in California. Crews are currently battling a series of devastating wildfires in and around Los Angeles. At least 5 people have died and more than 1,000 buildings have been destroyed. The fires have yet to be brought under control. Israel's military says it's retrieved the body of a hostage seized by Hamas during the 7th of October attacks in 2023. Troops recovered the remains of Yosef al-Zayadni from an underground tunnel in the Rafah area of southern Gaza. The leader of a Japanese crime syndicate has admitted trafficking nuclear materials from Myanmar. Takeshi Ebisawa pleaded guilty to conspiring with a network of associates to traffic uranium and weapons-grade plutonium from Myanmar to other countries. And a funeral takes place later today of the former US President Jimmy Carter, who died last week, aged 100. 4 former living presidents will attend the service at Washington National Cathedral. Joe Biden will deliver the eulogy. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. 8:33 in Zurich, which is where we head now. Switzerland is to join a scheme which simplifies the movement of military equipment across Europe. It's already possible in certain circumstances for EU member states to travel through Switzerland to transport equipment. So what does this change mean for those nations and also for the Swiss? Well, Gorana Gergic is Monocle security correspondent and senior researcher with the Swiss and Euro-Atlantic security team at the ETH Zurich Centre for Security Studies. I'm delighted to say she joins me on the line now. Very good morning to you, Gorana. How's Zurich looking this morning?
Morning, Emma. I am actually in Zagreb, not in Zurich, but it starts with a Z, and it's a major town on the European continent. And here it's pretty warm this morning. It's about 15 degrees, so we have no idea what this polar vortex is like that I think has hit your part of the sort of extended continent and space.
Thank you very much indeed for that update and for clarifying your location. We appreciate it. Tell us more about the military mobility project.
Well, this is part of the broader changes, obviously, that were offset by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022. But actually, some of the conversations as well that have been going on prior to that, and some that actually have a lot to do with what went on in 2014 with Russia's annexation of Crimea, of the war in Donbass that was going on for most part of the previous decade. And so basically, we can think about, first of all, the Swiss perspective, which is more of this demand side, if you wish, and then the EU perspective, which is more of the supply side of, who wants what and who is offering what. So from the Swiss perspective, we know from a bunch of Swiss security documents, key security policy documents, that Switzerland actually for the past couple of years has been expressing quite vocally that it wants to intensify security policy cooperation with the likes of the European Union and NATO, but in a way that it could still maintain, obviously, its policy of neutrality, which is sacrosanct, which is part of both sort of the political culture and tradition, as well as being codified in key legal documents. And then from the EU perspective, given that we are talking now about this particular PESCO deal, and PESCO stands for Permanent and Structured Cooperation in Security and Defense. This is something that in EU was established in 2017. So again, something that predates the full-scale Russia's war in Ukraine, but is connected obviously to the tectonic changes that have been occurring on the European continent as a result of annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, where basically European Union states agreed that they would jointly develop their defense capabilities and jointly conduct armament projects to basically be more capable in the space of security and defense. And this is then where we get to your question about what it is that Switzerland is doing at the moment. So what we will actually see today on the agenda of the Council of EU when they meet in Brussels is essentially one point which just confirms something that the Swiss Federal Council, or the Bundesrat, already approved back in August, and that is that Switzerland would be part of the military mobility project. This project is something that the European Union has been very much focused on, again, as part of the 22 Russia's war in Ukraine, because EU really wants to make itself more secure. And one way of doing that is to actually ramp up infrastructure to better ensure that military assets can be transported, that they're mobile across the bloc, whether it's a movement of troops or military equipment. European Commission, ever since the end of 22, has been working on a plan to better connect and protect its infrastructure.
Gorana Gergic, Monocle security correspondent, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. It's time now to talk fashion. Dana Thomas is Paris-based author of Fashionopolis, The Price of Fast Fashion and the Future of Clothes. A very good morning to you, Dana.
Good morning.
Let's head to the United States first for the National Medal of Freedom that was awarded to great dignitaries who've contributed to U.S. culture, U.S. economy, U.S. life, and two of those recipients were very much deeply stitched into the world of fashion.
Yes, absolutely. First was Ralph Lauren, who is the first fashion designer to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is an award that's given to it's the highest civilian honor in the country. It's sort of our equivalent of being knighted, or it's a big deal, and only I think 20 people get it. It's a very small club when it is bestowed upon people. So it included Jane Goodall this time, and a few other folks, and they're not always American. They can be from anywhere. But so we had Ralph Lauren, who arrived in, as one should, in a tweed blazer and a necktie, and he's 85 years old, and he was praised for reminding us of our distinct style as a nation of dreamers and doers. And then Anna Wintour, the editor of Vogue, who was born in Britain but is American too. She had American grandparents, I believe, who ran newspapers in Pennsylvania. And she has been editor-in-chief of Vogue since 1988 and pretty much runs all of the creative content for Condé Nast now. I think her title is Chief Creative Content Officer or something. And she also received the decoration, and she kindly did not wear her sunglasses, and she looked fantastic. It was so nice to see her smiling eyes. We so rarely see them. So that was very cool. Sort of out of the 20 or so that were given this award, 2 of them came from the fashion industry.
Were we surprised by this?
I was surprised. I was not surprised about Ralph. Ralph makes loads of sense. He's been dressing first ladies for years. He's been dressing American presidents for years. He's been, he dresses the American Olympics team. He's been part of the fabric of America, we could say, for a long time. I was surprised a bit about Anna, but then I had a long think about it and it made sense. She's been a very big Democratic Party supporter for years. At one point was rumored to be up for the job of ambassador to Paris or ambassador to the UK under Obama and under Biden. She raised a lot of money and hosted fundraisers for them in Paris during Fashion Week. So I think this was a bit of a thank you for them.
Let's move to French haute couture and the transfer of Maison Christian Lacroix into Spanish hands.
Yes, this is super interesting. So Christian Lacroix, of course, was the designer of the late 1980s. He founded his house in 1987, was the first house that Bernard Arnault founded and created from scratch at LVMH. He swiped Christian Lacroix from the House of Patou, and they created the House of Christian Lacroix. It was a time when I first started covering fashion. It was really quite a big scandal, and the House of Patou later sued Bernard Arnault and for basically devastating their company. But Christian Lacroix was, hot stuff in the 1980s, and but the company never made any money. It just struggled and struggled and struggled. So finally, about 20 years ago, I'd say 2005, it was sold to an American company called the Phallic Brothers, and I remember writing and meeting about them for Newsweek magazine. And they bought it, and they were good, and they own a duty-free company in Florida that's mainly on cruise ships, but around Florida. And they were going to do some great things with it, and it kind of, again, didn't go anywhere, and it's been sort of floundering ever since. And now this company, Spain's Sociedad Textil Lonia, or STL for short, has bought the house, and they also own C.H. Carolina Herrera, which is the lower price line of the Carolina Herrera company. So we're going to see what's going to happen. There's a lot of speculation that they're just going to take it down market and really just work the name, though I'm not sure that the name carries a lot of oomph in the market anymore, because under the Phallics, it kind of evaporated and disappeared. Christian Lacroix himself is still in the game on the side. He does a lot of decor for theater and for ballet and for opera. I actually wrote about one of the ballets he at the Paris Opera Ballet, for which he did the costumes, A Midsummer Night Dream. And he And so he's still around and he's still drawing and creating, but his namesake company has kind of faded from view. We'll see if these folks can bring it back.
Finally, we bid farewell to an amazing character from Italian fashion this week, to Rosita Missoni, the pioneer of the zigzag knit and a woman who was absolutely steeped in Italian textile.
Oh, she was just fantastic, Rosita. I actually saw her not long ago at the Venice Film Festival. I ran into her and her family and on their way to the movies, and she was still in fine form. That woman, she was just a little pistol, and she was as vibrant and as alive and as fun as the fabrics that her company designed. Those colorful zigzag fabrics that really came to the fore in the 1960s and the 70s. And, this clingy knitwear that was sexy and fun and cheerful at the same time. I mean, that right there was Rosita Missoni. She really did embody what they did. She and her husband, Ty, built this company together, and he died about 10 years ago. And he, too, was just most lovely. They met when they were teenagers, and she was in London as a student on a student trip, and he was competing as a hurdler in the Olympics. And she went out and saw this hurdler competing in the Olympics and said, "Who's that cute boy on the Italian team?" And they were together for, 50, 60, 70 years. And they founded this company together. She passed it on to her daughter, Angela, in the 1990s, and then started Missoni Home. And that turned out to be even more fabulous, I think, personally, than the clothing. I have a fair number of Missoni Home carpets in my house because they're just so beautiful. These folks, they understood textiles, they understood color, and the Missonis, and they brought beauty and color and life to life through fabrics, and not many people know how to do that, and certainly not in fashion. And there isn't really anyone doing it right now. They're going to be, both of them are going to be greatly missed. This is a big hole. On top of it, she lived well into her 90s, and she lived a full life. God bless her. We loved Rosita Missoni.
The end of an era. Dana Thomas, thank you so much for joining us on the line. You're listening to The Globalist. 7:46 here in London. Now, how much does Meta's Mark Zuckerberg need the benevolent gaze of the incoming US President Donald Trump? Well, it seems quite a bit, because earlier this week, Meta announced it was to abandon third-party fact-checking, preferring to rely on what it called community-based moderation. It's also hired Dana White, a long-time ally of Donald Trump, to join its board of directors. So to talk to us about this new direction, I'm joined by David Gilbert, a disinformation reporter for Wired. A very good morning to you, David.
Good morning.
So let's just rewind a little bit when it comes to Mark Zuckerberg. It's not long since his platforms were accused of spreading misinformation that may have helped elect Donald Trump. Mr. Zuckerberg then kicked Donald Trump off Facebook and Instagram because of what happened in on the Capitol Hill on January the 6th, 2021. So it all started off in one direction. What's changed?
I guess the political winds in the US have changed. When it was initially claimed that Mark Zuckerberg or that Donald Trump had been elected and that Facebook may have played a part in that disinformation on Facebook may have played a part, Mark Zuckerberg just dismissed it, laughed it off, said it was crazy, and eventually 2 years later had to kind of humbly walk back that claim in front of Congress. So he's kind of been flip-flopping for a while, but what we've seen over the last 6 weeks to a month and slightly longer than that, he's been kind of talking. I think about 6 months ago, he said in the podcast that he was done apologizing for what had happened in 2016 and everything else that had happened on Facebook. His stance towards people who had criticized the platform had changed. He had become much more bullish. But in the last 6 weeks, we've seen him dine at Mar-a-Lago with Donald Trump. We've seen him hand over $1 million to Trump's inauguration fund. We've seen him install Joel Kaplan, who's a Republican operative, as the top policy person at Facebook, replacing Nick Clegg. And as you say, in the last week, we've seen Dana White installed on the board, and we have seen Mark Zuckerberg effectively eradicate Meta's fact-checking efforts because of pressure that Donald Trump has put him under.
And this has, and I quote, left fact-checking organisations absolutely blindsided. They did not see this coming.
No, when I spoke to them on Tuesday hours after the news had broken, they were aghast. They didn't know that this was coming. They had no indication. And now it turns out that Meta did, in fact, contact the International Fact-Checking Network, the head of that, which is kind of this umbrella group that oversees all of these partners that Meta works with across the globe, just an hour before the announcement went live, to give them a very brief heads up. But the actual people who do the fact-checking, they had no idea. And for some of them, at least, this means that they will no longer be able to operate. And now, just to be clear, so far, Meta has said that it's only ending its partnerships in the US. So that's 10 different organizations it works with in the US that it gives money to in order for them to do this fact-checking on their platforms. They're ending that. But when you speak to fact-checking partners across the globe who are much more reliant on Facebook's money than those in the US, they are pretty much resigned to the fact that this is going to roll out globally and that Meta is going to end its fact-checking partnerships worldwide.
And how will this affect the rest of the world's ability to combat disinformation? Because we have the recent EU Digital Services Act, which requires companies to not only combat disinformation, but also to stop harmful content. It feels as if it's going to put the likes of the European Union on an absolute direct collision course.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And there was a report in French media yesterday saying that Facebook had already submitted a risk assessment, which they need to do in order to end their fact-checking partnerships in the EU. I haven't been able to confirm that yet, but it seems certain that Facebook, they want to take on the EU on this. If you listen to Mark Zuckerberg's video announcement about this, he mentions that he's going to work with the Trump administration to tackle what he sees as kind of onerous regulations that the EU have put in place. So I think there is definitely going to be a clash there. I think it's going to happen sooner rather than later. We already see that the EU has kind of started or weighed in against Elon Musk, who, Zuckerberg seems to be following his lead in terms of cozying up to Trump. And the EU has talked this week about Elon Musk's space that he's hosting today with the leader of the AfD in Germany, and how they're going to be monitoring that for potential violations of their rules. So I think the EU is on alert on this, and I think Zuckerberg seems to be at least ready for a fight to take them on and potentially pull out of fact-checking here in the EU altogether.
Does it feel, David, as if we are now entering a riskier era?
Without a doubt, and I think riskier for people who are at the fringes of society, people who are vulnerable. As well as ending the fact-checking this week, Facebook has also changed its policies in relation to the type of content that it's going to allow. And specifically, it is now going to allow comments against minorities and vulnerable people that it previously didn't allow. For example, one of my colleagues found that it's now allowing the idea that people can say that people who are LGBTQ, people who are trans, people who are gay are mentally ill. And that is not going to be a violation of Facebook's or Instagram or Threads rules from now on. And there are many other instances like that where people who had been protected by Facebook policies in the past will no longer be protected. And some of those groups are now extremely worried about what the future holds in terms of the type of harassment that they're going to face on these platforms.
David Gilbert, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Police officers in Paris have been told to turn down the volume and reduce the amount of times they use their sirens while getting across town. They are, according to a new research report, contributing a disproportionate amount of noise to the city, with some areas reporting up to half an hour a day of sirens measuring at 108.2 decibels. That's the equivalent of standing next to a chainsaw. Well, I'm joined now by Colette Davidson, a freelance journalist in Paris. Welcome back to Monocle Radio, Colette. Good to have you.
Hello, thanks. Thanks for having me.
So is it as noisy as this research suggests?
Oh, in parts of Paris, it definitely is. I mean, I love that chainsaw reference. That really rings true for me as a resident here. Sometimes it does feel like you're going a bit crazy with the noise. And, even small businesses are losing customers. People don't want to sit on a noisy outdoor terrace sipping a coffee with a police siren going by every few minutes. So it's definitely an issue. You also have, of course, the other noise like motorcycles and trucks and cars honking. So when a police siren, adds to that noise, it just can make it quite unbearable in certain neighborhoods. And just explain to us the idea of certain neighbourhoods being particularly vulnerable to this. I think one of the examples was near a court of law, which you would, dare I say it, imagine that there'd be quite a lot of police around. Yes, definitely. Near the main core building in the west of the city, where you have police cars and vans bringing inmates to hearings, you have excessive noise. Also, at the crossroads between maybe a hospital and a police station or a fire station, you're going to have cars, sirens going back and forth constantly. So there are definitely neighborhoods that are being hardest hit, and that's why the city is going to install 4 new detectors at a cost of 20,000 euros. And they're going to put those in 4 different neighborhoods that are the hardest hit and try to just crack down on this noise and get people thinking about how they use their sirens. There is a joke among Parisians, it's an old one, that suggests that when the police put their sirens on, they're heading to the bar for an aperitif. How much is that actually true? Well, it's really hard to say. I mean, I think that probably is a bit of a joke, but officials have actually suggested that within the police force, officers are using their sirens to get back to the station in the evening more quickly, to get home from work. And I would just say, anecdotally, Parisians do feel that officers are using their sirens unnecessarily. But, a common situation that the city is trying to focus on and crack down on is when you have a street blocked with traffic, either because of a traffic light or a car that is double parked, and a siren, is going off for 10 minutes while an emergency vehicle is trying to get through. Those cars that are stuck can't really go anywhere, and neither can the emergency vehicle. But the city is suggesting that what they can do is just simply turn off their sirens so people can feel a bit more sane in those situations. Very briefly, because I'm afraid time's running out, is there a bigger issue here that the French just don't like the police? Well, I mean, that has definitely been alluded to. I mean, it has been suggested that, the police, while they're supposedly there to help, they're not necessarily as helpful as they could be. So perhaps a little animosity creeping in there as well. Colette Davidson, thank you so much for joining us live on The Globalist. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and also to our producers, Laura Kramer, Chris Chermak and Hassan Anderson. Our research was Maisie Ringer and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. We've also got the bulletin with UBS and Monocle on Design. I'll be back live at midday here in London with the briefing, with a full update of all the day's biggest stories across the world. And The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.